It's like me, a little bit slow this morning. I have got to that way. Good morning, Wednesday, February 26th, 2025, here in the House Transportation Committee. Real quick for the committee, the agenda is going to change slightly this morning. The 10 and the 10:30 are flipping. We're breaking at 10 and coming back at 10:30. Instead of breaking at 10:30, there's a number of members that are going to be attending another event, and Logan and the JFO was gracious enough and available enough to switch his. So we're breaking at 10 and come back with Logan at 10:30, which is great because it'll fall right into the next piece that he does after that. So with that, we're going to get started this morning. Candace Elmquist is here, the CFO of the Agency of Transportation, and partner who's coming up next. Good morning. Welcome back to the committee. We appreciate all the time and effort that you give us. It's an awful lot of money, and you're the one that has all the dollars and cents for us. So with that, welcome. Glad to have you back, and please take it on over.
For the record, Candace Elmquist, Chief Financial Officer. So I was asked to come in and give a refresh, I think, of this presentation that we've already seen once. Jeremy and I were in here on February 11th. This slide deck should seem fairly familiar. If it's okay with the committee, I will just go through each page quickly to remind us what this slide deck's talking about, and then we made some updates to the end of the deck. So on this slide, I was talking about a $46 million one-time revenue hole that we had when we started the FY26 budget process. Here I talk about adjustments that we had to make to the current fiscal year, FY25, and how that resulted in us needing to commit to 1.1 million worth of reversions for this upcoming July. On this slide, oh, sorry, I gotta move something on my slide. There we go. On this slide, I talk about known pressures that we had when we started the FY26 budget process, in addition to the 46 million. Known pressures being salaries of our employees, benefits of our employees, internal service fund and service level agreement charges from finance and management and ODS, and our central garage ISF billings. And that's a total of $15.5 million. So in total, we started the FY26 budget process with $61.5 million to fund. The next slide talks about how we found 61.5 million. We used 10.3 from the revenue forecast. We used the 20.25 from the JTAC appropriation, the money that historically has gone to public safety, which in the governor's recommended proposal is backfilled with general fund. The use of 12.5 million, which is currently reserved for us for state match for IIJ projects in the cash fund, and that would also be dependent on the passage of language in section in the D section of the budget bill. 14 million in budget reduction proposals, which is primarily from highway projects, and then an additional 4.5 million, which we are committed to finding this July.
Representative Powers?
Yeah, so I'm clear, and I think it's right. On the third item there, the cash fund, we've been doing that over the years, right?
This is only the second time we've had an amount reserved for us in the cash fund. The first time it happened, it was 25 million, and we used that full 25 million amount to balance the current fiscal year, FY25. So the 12.5 was reserved for us last year, and we are proposing to use it for the 26 budget. So that is a known hole going into 27. Given that we're balancing 26 with one-time revenue.
I sort of missed what you said, something about match for IIJA. Can you repeat what you said about that?
Yes, the reserved amount is specifically for state match for projects funded via the IIJA Federal Act.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Here we have a slide of the history of the JTOC, but I defer to Legislative Council. Because I have also heard from Senate Transportation that this doesn't go back far enough. We were able to find legislative citations back to 2002. But Senate Transportation said, no, JTAC really started in the 90s. So this is just to give the committee a little bit of history on how the JTAC appropriation has changed throughout the years. But it is currently at that 20.25 figure for public safety. And this next slide here is giving the committee information on what would happen to AOT's budget if the JTAC appropriation were not available for our use to balance 26. You'll remember this slide as being paving and roadway projects, the 12.5 million that would be available if these projects were to be delayed into a future fiscal year. And I'm now going to defer to Jeremy Reed, Chief Engineer, to maybe give us a status of these projects.
Yes, thank you, Candace. Jeremy Reed, Chief Engineer. I think you may remember when I first presented this list, I mentioned that we're executing these projects now, and the available savings diminishes as we sign contracts because we will need to pay the contractor something for either get out of the contract entirely or to delay it a year. So just for the point of a update on that, the first two projects, Berrytown and Orange Thompson, have been executed. So we have an executed contract with that contractor. Chelsea, Washington has been awarded to a contractor. Sheldon, Enosburg, and Thetford Fairley are advertised as we speak, as are the 3 Brattleboro projects. And Berry City is due to be advertised on March 19th. So the remaining projects are still sort of available for that full savings, but the others have some diminished savings at this point.
Questions on this list?
If it doesn't happen, you'll have to follow the whole new list. Huh?
Well, as I said, in the previous testimony, this list was developed by looking at the projects that have match associated with the transportation fund. Most of our bridge projects are funded out of the TIP fund. So those really don't provide any transportation fund savings. Secondly, we removed any emergency relief flood recovery projects because again, the state match isn't coming from the transportation fund for those. And then we looked at projects that were 100% federally funded because obviously we're not getting any transportation fund. And this list largely is all that's left. Now, there are a few like 90-10 projects, meaning 90% federal, 10% state. But I think to your point, Chair, it's the options are becoming fewer and fewer as we progress towards construction season. And at some point in time, I don't know that we will be able to achieve a $12.5 million savings if we were asked to do so, say, the first week of May.
And for our, representative.
Could you just speak to the broader $14 million reduction in highway projects for a second? I mean, being on this committee, I'm now paying a lot more attention to paving.
Okay.
In particular, the ride on Route 89 going south from Middlesex to Montpelier, the slow lane is really looking not great.
Correct.
And also roads in my town, I'm just looking at them with a different lens. And then we also heard testimony from some of the paver vendors that you all work with, expressing some real concern about the ability to pave 125 miles of roads versus 250 if I'm getting them. So could you just, I would just love to hear your.
Sure.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, it's 14 million T fund total AOT, but only 9.2 from highways. So that's what.
Okay.
Darren-
Thank you.
And that's part of the governor's recommend budget. And that's where we look at the 10G reports projects that were pushed. those are those projects that were pushed. Now, to your specific question related to, how we came up with the 12.5 for the JTOC transfer, one of the projects, 89 Waterbury Montpelier Southbound, is one of those. Principally due to safety concerns, we want to maintain that project. So that is soon to be advertised, but we left that in the program and didn't look at it. I am going to give a presentation here in a half hour or so that I think speaks more to your point, like globally, where do we expect the network condition to go at different funding levels? And, what does the out year deterioration look like?
Thank you.
I guess I have a little bit of a question, maybe, when the 14 million that you used to help cover the 61, pushing a whole series of projects off already, that's not the same list.
Correct.
Right. How much of that could we have done if we'd had the 14 million?
I
Or was
think
that stuff that was possibly being pushed or what? How much more construction work could we have gotten done out of that 14 million?
I have-
If we didn't have such a budget
yeah,
issue.
so I have confidence we could have delivered $14 million worth of those projects and whatever associated federal match was available.
Okay.
The governor's recommend as delivered was uniquely federally and state constrained. That being said, there's nothing saying we couldn't potentially deliver state funded only projects, although that's a fairly unusual position for us to be in.
So some of the reductions in the highway proposals were because of the federal constraint. I'd say it's about 50%.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're comfortable where we are with our federal spending status at this point. We did have to make up for a little bit of the inflation that we saw in previous years, and that's what lowered our federal constraint a little bit this year. So I think where we're at today in the governor's recommend is a equally constrained budget from both the federal and state perspective.
Be good to move on. If you want kind of review of where we've already been, but we have been into House appropriations and the Senate and here and talking this up. I guess I would gather the message on this has been pretty well delivered at this point, but that's the whole reason to go back and review. It's certainly not set yet, and we're not done with it yet, and we're headed to the next, setting the stage of the next pieces that we're looking at. So please keep on going.
These final two slides were not in our February 11th slide deck. We had said to the committee at that time that we'd need more time to review where else we would take reductions to find the remaining 8 million to get to 20.25 from the 12.5. So we've identified 4 million in T-Fund from pushing some aviation and rail projects, which are detailed here. I'm also not the subject matter expert on these slides, but we do have Michelle Boomhauer in the room, and I do know that rail and aviation identified these projects as ones that would be part of the list if we needed to find savings, not having the JTAC appropriation. So that is 4 million, and to get us up to another 4 million for the total of 8, we would propose taking 2 million from district maintenance and fleet by reducing salt usage and winter overtime employee costs by 15%. 1 million from finance and administration by the use of position management strategies to reduce salary and benefit costs, PDD. And then another 1 million from the Department of Motor Vehicles by reviewing customer service hours at their meetings.
Are you saying that you'll have to control the weather for next winter? It can't be like this.
Absolutely.
We can't have this winter weather is next year.
I am sure Maintenance Director Ernie Patno would have a lot to say about this 15% reduction, but it was his proposal. But he would have a lot to say about it.
Okay. And now we're on to the next.
Okay, so this This is all I had to share on the JTAC appropriation slide deck, you know, because we had previously talked about it too, but I'm happy to move on. Great. So I am going to figure out how to stop sharing for a second. Give me just a moment.
Now we're going to the out year views in terms of, that was the scramble that we were doing, or was part of the scramble that was done, and the potential of further scramble that would have to be done if that was undone. Now we're talking about, okay, let's look at next year and the year after potentially of where we're at. If we were scrambling as much as we were, or my perception of trying to pull the budget together to get work done this year, last year and this year, now we're looking at the next several years. What potentially situation are we in? And historically, the view has always been that we don't ever want to leave federal money on the table when the return is the 4-to-1, the 80-20s and the 90-10s. Now we're talking about all things being equal and whatnot, or not being equal, and the money that did or didn't come over from the general fund and the pieces that we patched in the last few years, and now the JTOG. And what's next, since there's not also IIJA and American and all of the other ones that you keep track of so well, but this is what we're trying to set the stage. That was a review of where we got to for this year's budget. What happens next is what we're talking about here.
Thank you, Chair, for that opener. So this is our federal fund and state match outlook. A similar format has been presented to the committee in prior years, so should look similar. There are a lot of assumptions going on in this chart, and I do know it's dense. I can zoom in if we need to. But I think the biggest assumption here is what's going to be the next iteration of IIJA. In order to project out to beyond federal fiscal year 26, we had to make an assumption on what the next iteration of IIJA would be. And I will preface it by saying I know no, insider information on that, but we did rely on our consultant who helped us with the revenue study that was legislatively dictated last session. Our consultant for that was CDM Smith, and they said it is reasonable to use a 2.5% inflation factor. And that assumption is a big one because as we, hear things coming out from Washington, it may be less than IIJA, it may be more, it may be the same. So what we're seeing here is what our federal funds available would be at a 2.5% growth rate. If that holds true, then I do believe we would be starting FY27 with something similar to a $30 million deficit or possibly less. The component of that $30 million is the $12.5 million that we are relying on this year from the cash fund, known one-time revenue source, $4.5 million that we're relying on as reversions to be found in July. I have to figure out how difficult those reversions will be taken in July. If 4.5 million is able to be taken relatively easily, then I would take that off of the deficit and say, okay, I think I could find around $5 million of reversions each year, but I don't. It was very, very challenging to take $12.5 million of reversions last year. So I know that it can't be as big as 12.5, but I don't know if 5 is the magic number. And then the remaining is really going to be state match for discretionary grants. We don't start seeing a problem with state match for the next iteration of IIJA until the projection for 2028. So for 2027, I'm confident that the difference between the cash fund and the reversions is just the state match for discretionary. And discretionary is a wish list, but we have already obtained some items on this list.
And I would also add that we have some degree of confidence that we will obtain others as well. So Yes, it's a wish list, but it isn't entirely aspirational. We can go through those, provide more detail, but, I think it would be safe to say that we are going to get a good chunk of those grants. Or have already received those grants.
The assumption on inflation for projects and state salary increases is 3%. We do realize that also may not be a big enough inflation factor. And I also want to be clear that the deficit in 2027 assumes that we have the JTAC appropriation available to us. So if we did not have the JTAC appropriation available to us in 2027, we would need to add $20.25 million onto that deficit.
So the whole would be very similar to this year's. Well,
Yes.
Okay. So 50 instead of 60 years to start that. Right. Okay, I'm sorry, yes, Representative Keith.
So, explain and I can barely read it, but the second and third line down goes 0 on the projections, and I just want to understand why. At the very top.
At the top.
Yeah.
Oh, here.
Yeah,
Oh, the
yeah.
general fund bridge program and general fund
Yeah.
electric vehicle program.
Yeah,
Those are components of IIJA, but unknown if they will be components of the next iteration. So we did not assume a factor for those. Anything else on the journey?
No, so the top line is our traditional formula funds core programs. Within IIJA, there are some add-ons. And so there is a general fund bridge program and the NEVI program with federal reauthorization uncertain. We did not include those carrying forward. We just built it off our traditional federal formula program assumptions with a 3% inflation.
so those numbers represent federal dollars.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so all of the numbers on the top three areas are a composite federal number. And then we distill down the match required to pull those federal dollars.
Thank you.
Representative Burke.
So the 4.5 million in current law for 26 for the NEVI program is an unknown. That's what is supposed to happen, but we don't know if it's going to happen.
It is an unknown, and actually at this moment, the current NEVI funds have been rescinded.
So that's doesn't exist.
$15 million have been rescinded from the NEVI program under the current federal administration.
Just a quick clarification, is rescinded different than frozen? Because last we heard they were frozen. Is this an escalation of that or?
Yes, that's an installation.
Yeah, just by just sort of looking at it and saying, okay, just some top dollar spending and activity on our total infrastructure that we're projected out, we're gonna spend potentially $50 million less on our program in projection of 2027, under 300 million. And we're spending, we got up to 349 to 350,000 in 2024, or 350 million. And now we're gonna be dropping under 300 million. So you're looking at the first gray section. And we know that's the total spend, but what we can buy with it is dramatically less
Absolutely.
than what it was. So we're not only headed to a spot where less money's coming from the feds, in effect, right? Is that not what, when less money is coming and what we get out of it and what we spend on it is dramatically less. So the condition of, which is what sets the stage for our next presentation, the potential impact for Vermonters in terms of what we drive on and what we cross the rivers on. We're going to have substantially less activity and get substantially less done. No matter how hard they work and no matter how good our vendors are and how good our contractors are and how well our agency plans. What this tells me, I guess, is the message for Vermonters is, if you don't like the way the condition of the roads are now, just hold on for a little while.
But I guess that's,
But is that really true or not true? I don't-
Well, the way I look at it, I go down to the total federal spending and that's gone up. I think we're just
Oh, okay.
getting money in different areas. I mean, we
Okay,
get our formula funds that are obviously gonna probably take a hit, but it seems like we're quite confident that we're gonna make it up in other areas and competitive grants. But again, does it have effect on paving and bridges? I'm sure it does, but the federal spending is going up.
Well,
Just not where we probably like it maybe, if interbase funding.
well, I would offer that competitive grants have always been part of our program.
Yeah.
And so for this exercise, we pulled them out, but if you look at work done previously or even today, a lot of that is being funded by federal grants, right?
Mhm.
So, we have no idea what the federal reauthorization is going to look like. I could be here in 3 years telling you I need incredible amount of increase of state match, or I can have a surplus of transportation fund money because federal reauthorization went down. We've, made some assumptions, but given the uncertainty in Washington in general, let alone with this administration, we just don't know what it's gonna look like in 2 years.
No, absolutely. But what I'm saying is, in 2027, we're anticipating 400, like I said, a guess, but 408 million federal dollars, which is obviously more. So the problem is trying to match that.
And that
We don't have the
huge-
state.
right, and the
to do
huge
it.
increase,
Yeah.
protect, I guess, is a huge portion of more than most of it, so protect, remind me again, under,
So that's one of the grants that we probably have less confidence in. to be
Well,
honest with you.
a massive number.
So it's a pretty massive number, and it actually represents 2 separate grants, one for rockfall stabilization and one for some culverts. So that's probably one of the least confident grant awards we will get. Not only just because of the size of it, but just the program itself. I'm not sure what the current administration will view of that program.
And what's the match on that?
I believe that's 90/10.
90.
I can turn it over to
Um,
Jeremy now to talk
I
about.
just want to make sure, well, you might be the one to answer, jump, Michelle, but when you look at like rail and the big bump out in 2028, that is when Dan comes in, the library comes in and comes in and talks about his applications for things that he's confident are going to come down. And he's always working on things out years in advance, and he's pretty certain there's going to be that fairly large rail grant in 2028. That's the testimony that ties back to what we heard, and that's where these outline ones that pop up and come up are projects or grants that you've been working on for X amount of time, and pretty sure we're going to get then. But it doesn't change what we can do on our own roads and bridges in that particular case is rail. But is that how that money ends up being
Correct.
confident we're gonna get that grant?
Right, so I think rail and aviation is almost wholly dependent on competitive grants. And so what you're seeing is just grants that we've applied for in the out years, essentially to fund our capital program.
Those are 2 huge jumps in 2028. Both in rail and aviation, those are huge jumps on project and activity. So the numbers look like we're spending a lot more, but when it comes back to, that's not on roads, it's not on roads and bridges, I guess, that's not, so I'm gonna help explain where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I'll let Michelle speak.
Or either way, I'm just looking at that, if you don't mind.
None at all. For the record, Michelle Boonhauer, Agency of Transportation. So one of the goals of the state long-range rail plan is to move all of our bridge and rail infrastructure to be able to carry 286,000 pound capacity cars. And because we don't have formula funding for the rail system, we have to rely on grants. There was a really large, one of those large numbers, I don't remember how much it was for a CRISI grant, that's one of the acronyms. That we applied for this year, or maybe it's the end of last year, and we didn't get the award, but Genesee and Wyoming, which runs New England Central Railroad, received an award which will help with Vermont's rail system. But we still, as the state and owner of the railroad, have certain responsibilities that we have to implement. And so the chunk of money you're looking at will bring, right now, we're working on a 5-year build project where we took 29 bridges between Rutland and Hoosick, New York, and brought them up to 286,000 pound capacity. This will install the continuously welded rail, which is needed to its increased track speeds and weight carrying limits and for safety reasons. The next 2 railroad sections that we're anticipating working on are the Green Mountain Railroad between Rutland and Bellows Falls, and then the Connecticut rail line between Way River Junction and Derby for Newport. So, you know, barring these types of infrastructure investments, all we would be doing is band-aiding or potentially having to close rail lines.
So, thank you, Michelle. So what I remember that testimony pretty well. I'm trying to, and I think what that does is highlight, if you're looking at the yellow line of federal highway fund or total federal funding, that's important to see that it's going up. But when you take out rail, aviation, and grants that were going in that direction, and we get back up to the idea of what highway spending is, the highway spending is still the issue in terms of buying way less. I would say that part of my concern is I wouldn't want people to look at federal funding and say, oh, we're going to be fine. Because that federal funding, massive chunks are in those areas that are not on the highway. And that's, I guess, and I'm trying to highlight that again, I guess, to make sure I'm understanding it, that although federal funding is still potentially jumping significantly because of those rail and aviation, highway funding is, to me, still seems like a big step backwards. Unless there is a huge change in the Highway Reauthorization Act or a new, I don't know what it is, build, America back, whatever that piece is that puts up another big chunk like IIJA did for us, or did for every state, and that causes some problems with competitive bids and inflation and problem. But that I'm saying, I would like to be clear that I understanding of the gray line versus the yellow highlights that rail and aviation throws that number to make it look much better picture than what we're talking about on roads.
Yes,
Unless I'm misunderstanding, if you can help me, am I headed in the right direction or not, or are you on the same? Tell me whether I am or am not looking at this right.
You're absolutely correct, where this trend of actuals that we've been presenting for the past couple of years only has the actual figure for core highway programs, and it does not have the actuals for competitive programs, including rail and aviation. But when and if we update this chart in a future iteration, you would see the yellow line total federal funding go up to take into consideration that we've been relying on discretionary grants for the past few years too. This is not a new thing that we're applying for discretionary grants this year.
I know the agency's aversion to bonding. And is there an opportunity to bond bridges, road bridges for any of this?
The bonding conversation is something that we talk about in coordination with the administration. So there could be an opportunity, like dependent on the administration's appetite for bonding.
And right now it's 0. Yeah. Okay. Just thank you.
And along that lines, project has to be something that is a X number of years investment and long. It also has to be a certain amount of money to make it worthwhile to do that. I don't recall didn't we receive some testimony about the very limited number of projects that actually qualify or even bring the conversation, which I'm not opposed to. I may not share the administration's view on completely against bonding or not, but my understanding is I thought that bonding, part of our testimony, the testimony we received, is very limited in our current plans, our current white book plans and our current view of future projects. That might be outside of that would certainly the bridges are the most expensive thing we're working on is on 91, and the interchanges on 89 are the far and away the most expensive projects in the book. limited number one of those are available to bonding. Am I not understanding that testimony that we've had before?
You're correct. Don't do anything to.
Yeah, so the TIB fund, which where any bond payoff would come from, is largely limited to projects with a longer life cycle than paving projects would be. I don't know that there's a minimum project threshold. I'm not saying there isn't, I just don't know it off the top of my head. But I think just given the construct of the TIB bond in current statute, we would be looking for bridge projects if there was a directive from either this body or the administration.
And then in those, we're only responsible for 10%.
Well, it depends. So on the interstate system, it's 90-10, correct? But if we somehow bundled or had a desire to do something off the interstate system, it would probably be closer to 80-20.
Representative Cloud?
Yeah, thank you. And I may be wrong, but I thought one of the last times we did bond was the Champlain Bridge. No?
I don't know, Michelle, do you have that history?
I cannot recall. I know New York paid for a fair amount of that bridge, but I'm not sure if we had to bond on that. I can find out for you if you're interested.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what we did bonds for, but in my mind, it was like when something comes up, you have no idea, you know, you put it on the credit card because you have no other way to fix it, but you have to, you know, buy new tires or whatever.
I think that's a fair point that bonding isn't a fix, it's just delaying the payment.
Well, yes, but at the same time, if we know the prices are gonna continue to go out of control, you can lock in the price that we have today. That's a whole nother conversation. If we want to put TIP funding and have you back, we could consider that as a future piece, but the purpose of this is, I guess, to echo or to look at what we're at with this 1 year budget cycle. Sometimes we can look at what's next, and that's what we're trying to get at here. I don't want to shortchange the time on what the next piece is. I'm not sure where we are. If there's more questions or whatnot, I like the direction that you're talking about, and there's a lot to that. But Representative White?
I am a little fixated on the IIJ funds at the top here and the conversation about NEVI funds being rescinded. So we're looking at fiscal year 2026, and there's still $4 million, $4.5 million in the electric vehicle program, but I thought you said that was rescinded. So why are we seeing $4 million in 2026 of the year?
This was a snapshot in time.
Okay.
Funds were rescinded like last week.
Okay. So is that accurate though? Do we have that money?
No.
And that will be, okay, so that'll change.
Yeah,
Okay.
I wasn't intending
Okay.
to do an update
I
of this
gotcha. Okay.
outlook, but I could if the committee wanted.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding. And just a follow up. So knowing that NEVI funds were rescinded, are there other federal programs that we know have been rescinded?
No.
Okay.
There are funds under review. We have all of our discretionary programs currently under review. But NEVI is the only one that has been rescinded.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Representative Lally, or I'm sorry. Representative Thomason, did you have your hand up there or not?
No,
Oh,
thanks.
I'm sorry, Representative Lally?
Is there just a real general ballpark figure of what that might be? All discretionary programs?
Yes, we do have a deck that we've created for Senate Transportation and we'd be happy to share it with the House.
Great, thanks.
And did you want to jump in?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the NEVI program that one might think that, oh, if we don't have those federal dollars, there's probably some match dollars that aren't being spent on something. However, for everybody's awareness, the match for the NEVI program funds came from the vendors as part of the public-private partnership. And so their investment covered our required match. So we basically had several, we had a few contracts awarded that we are going to have to rescind, and we had several awarded that were not contracted yet, where we will have to advise once we get sort of the final word from FHWA advising that we will not be contracted.
Thank you very much. Are we in a spot to switch, to go to the next portion, which is they're supposed to stack on top of each other to a certain degree here today? I guess, Candace, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess welcome, Jeremy, although you're already here and already participating, so we're happy to have you either way.
Okay, good morning, committee. Yes, Jeremy Reed, Chief Engineer for the Agency of Transportation. The intent with this presentation is just to provide some level of outlook on network conditions given the current funding that we are currently receiving. This was a little bit longer presentation in Senate, so I'll try to sort of stay a little bit higher level and get less into the weeds of the methodology, but by all means, if there are any questions, please chime in. So, this is principally focused on pavement and bridges as being some of the core assets. So what we do is every year on the NHS, we go out and collect the pavement condition, and every 2 years on the rest of the network. Essentially, we get a data point for every 5/100ths of a mile. And within that data point, we get the ride, which is the roughness, smoothness, any rutting, which we're seeing out here on 89, and then two types of cracking, one being structural. So that means just the load is breaking up the pavement structure. And then we have environmental, which could be caused by shrinkage and expansion within the pavement structure, or potential heaving where it just sort of opens up and then closes once the heave goes away. So with that, we take those numbers, put them into a statistical calculation, and we get what's called the pavement composite index, which is that 0 to 100 number that you guys have seen in the past, and that's what we publish on Deep Transparency. We then assign a rating to that number. 80 to 100 is good, 65 to 80 is fair, 40 to 65 is poor, and anything less than 40 is considered very poor. How we did this is we actually took people out and drove a section of road with them and said, how would you classify this road? We knew what the PCI was, and we just wanted to get their sort of somewhat more subjective opinion. And so that's how we determined this instead of just doing 25-point increments. Here's just some pictures of what a good, fair, poor, and very poor road would look like. Obviously, I think the pictures speak for themselves, so I won't get into that. So I think this is the meat and potatoes of what we're looking for today. Again, we do have two performance measures that are decades old. One is that we want to maintain no more than 25% of our roadway network is in very poor condition. And the second one is we want to have a travel weighted average of 70 or better. What those represent, the travel weighted average, is a multiplier times the number of cars that are traveling that roadway. So it's weighted to the number of users. So that better reflects the overall user's experience across the network. And then the 25% not very poor is representative of that even in a rural, lightly traveled road, we want to have, a certain percentage that does not exceed that very poor percentage, right? We want a minimal level of expectation. So what we see here with the current paving budget of 103 million is our current very poor condition is about 6%. And we have a travel weighted average of roughly 74. Over time, we see the travel weighted average drop and ultimately land somewhere in the mid 60s. And our very poor condition ultimately gets all the way up to 48% over the next 10-year window, and ultimately exceeding the 25% performance measure in 2030. I would also add that 25% performance measure is not reflective of what is necessarily acceptable to the users. And so that's our performance measure, but that doesn't necessarily equate to a level of satisfaction.
Representative Pouch, next question.
Just so this assumes 103 million, no inflation or anything, that amount.
Correct.
We lose a little bit from that, it's just inflation.
So what we did is we said, I think the methodology said at this current buying power, we didn't make any assumptions on increased revenue or increased cost. We just said at $103 million today's buying power, this is what we expect. Any other questions on paving? Okay. And here's just a chart showing some of the mileage. Certainly, the paving industry comes in and speaks to miles, and they're not wrong, but this does present a little bit of what historic mileage has been in the last 5 years.
Representative McCoy.
So 21, 22, is that COVID money?
This was the beginning of IIJ.
IIJ.
Switching to bridges, we have basically 2,800 structures in Vermont that are over 20 feet. Those are what we classify as long structures. 6 to 20 feet would be considered a short structure. Of those 2,800 structures, 1,100 of them are on VTrans owned and maintained roadways. 314 of those are on the interstate. And then there are also nearly 1,700 long structures, either on town highways or on private roads.
Where's that?
This is the Route 30 West River Bridge down in Bennington. Oh, Brattleboro, excuse me.
That's my bridge. Yeah.
Yes, it is. And so sort of interesting. Yeah, no. Yeah, so sort of interesting, you see the old truss bridge and then the new segmental bridge. So our bridge inspectors go out and review every bridge every 2 years, and depending on condition, that frequency can become less. And what they look at is 3 components: the deck, which is that concrete riding surface; the superstructure, which is the structural steel that actually supports the deck; and then the substructure, so any abutments, wing walls, things of that nature. There's 3 ratings: good, fair, and poor. A good is rated 7 to 9, fair is 5 to 6, and a poor is 0 to 4. Anything with a rating of 4 or less gets inspected more frequently than the 2 years. It has to have at least an annual inspection cycle. The lowest scoring component dictates the score of the bridge. So if you had a deck rated a 4, but the superstructure and substructure were 7s, that bridge would be rated a 4. The performance measures that we're going to talk about are not on a unit basis, meaning not all bridges are created equal. We take that unit or take that score and apply it to the square footage of the bridge. So a bigger bridge has a larger impact than a smaller bridge. And these are all consistent with federal highway reporting standards. So if we look at the interstate bridge condition, basically our goal is 6%. I won't say goal, but our performance target is 6% in poor condition. We are currently at 7, but we expect that to go down. I would say that if anyone's familiar with sort of some of our historic numbers, they actually changed some of the metrics for how we score our bridges this past year or year ago. And so we saw a little bit of a jump. Our bridges didn't immediately or drastically get worse. It's just how we ranked them did. That being said, we do have some projects where we expect to take some of that poor condition off the network in the coming years.
Yeah, I think, is it fair to say that, so you're saying, hey, these are sort of federal standards of how to measure this stuff. Is it fair to say you're totally on board with these measurements? We're not chasing measurements that may not really be the right thing to be working on?
That is absolutely true for bridges. We have a more precise methodology for pavements than federal highway requires. So we do report to federal highway standards for pavements, but for our analytics, we use a more precise methodology just to, hopefully give us a little bit better outcome. But on the bridge side of the house, everything is consistent with the federal standard. For the state bridge condition, our performance target is 10%. And you can see that our poor conditions will increase, but stay below that 10%. And then for town bridges, the performance target is 12% in poor condition. And you can see, again, there's going to be an increase, but we stay below the performance target. One thing I want to,
Sorry, no.
I'm sorry, I love to state it. The bridge ones don't have the sort of number of cars that are over. It's just, you could just get.
It's a square foot.
Okay, doesn't matter, yeah.
and that's why the performance targets are different. They go from 6% on the interstate to 12% on a town highway. The performance targets are set sort of reflective of that network dependency, what we call it. One thing I would say about the bridge conditions, both good and bad, is that they are less responsive to investments, right? So just because of the life cycle of a bridge, it takes longer for a bridge to deteriorate. That being said, as our bridge conditions deteriorate, it takes a much larger investment to make a statistical change. So, pavement, if we just talk about a 10 to 15 year life cycle, is much more responsive to investments on an annual basis than bridges, which have, I'll just say, a 50 to 100 year life cycle, depending on the vintage of it. I would also add that this presentation doesn't look at a couple key components. One, mentioned Rock Falls earlier. Those are projects within our roadway program, and we don't have as good of predictive condition on those. And within the highway program or roadway program, there isn't a dedicated pot of money for rockfall. We sort of take it as the condition deteriorates. There are also no dedicated money for what would be large culverts today that may turn into a bridge in the future. Certainly with our resiliency and environmental efforts, we will see a lot of upsizing within the culverts. And again, there's no specific pot of money for that. A lot of that's either in the bridge program or the roadway program. We also are not presenting on anything related to maintenance of our overhead side assemblies or our signal systems. That's outside of this presentation, but still certainly needs that are reflective in our overall budget.
So Lally, and then we're going away.
Could you tell us again, or tell me again what Rock Fall refers to?
Yeah, ledge cut, essentially. So as we get freeze-thaw cycles, those things deteriorate.
Is that one on 91, the largest example up there?
Yeah, fairly being, ballpark, it's a $15 to $20 million project, so it's not insignificant. I would also offer that in my time as chief engineer, we've had, I think, 3 interstate closures due to ledge falls.
So I just had a quick question. One of my constituents, said to me that, the average Vermont bridge is 35% older than the rest of the bridges in the USA. Is that accurate?
I don't know that. I've never heard that. I know we have a lot of bridges that are still of the vintage from the 27 flood. And certainly our interstate system built between, just say, the mid 60s to the early 80s is coming up to that time frame where a major rehabilitation is due or replacement. I will also say, though, that on a national level, our bridge condition is very good compared to our peers.
And I think I remember you or one of your colleagues saying that Vermont's expectations is to get about 100 years out of the bridge. Is that correct?
That's the goal. Now there is going to be a rehabilitation in that window at some point. So it's not just walk away for 100 years, but that is the goal, given the current materials and the use of de-icing salts and things.
Probably not, something we want to highlight, but it would be interesting to see where I don't think we see data of where we stand compared to other states. Because if it looks like, hey, Vermont's doing good, we can be proud of it. But, people might say, oh, we don't need to spend as much money, or it's not as critical, or all that. And I'm not saying that at all. But it would be good to see that, just as we get complaints, we can put some reality on it and say, well, understand those complaints, but understand the need to continue investments. But we, overall, as a state, we're doing a good job, I guess.
And I think we can pull those numbers fairly easily. But as I started out, and what you're touching on is the customer satisfaction does not equate to federal standards. And that's,
Agreed, yeah.
That's certainly a component of what we do.
There you go. Towards
This is it.
that's where
That's it.
I'm going to throw my comment in if I don't know we're that close. But our strategy of waiting until there's a major declaration to repair a ton of bridges so that we're now ahead of the curve that I've heard in this testimony before is not exactly the best strategy in the long term for all of our infrastructure. And that's what's allowed us to get to the spot where the bridges are in better shape, which is actually not a pre-planned out strategic effort to improve them. It was a reaction to natural disasters. I don't want people to think that the reason our bridges are in great shape are because we had a tremendous clear path on our infrastructure on a long-term plan with funding that they could rely on to plan out and build them. They responded incredibly fast to every major disaster that occurred and rebuilt everything in a very fast time frame and was approved for the emergency pieces. Unless I'm off base, but that's what I heard in testimony earlier multiple times. This was not some successful long-term strategy that got us here. It was almost Mother Nature, but that might be a bit of a stretch, but
Especially on
anyway.
the rail side, I remember.
Yeah, I think certainly that's true for the state side. I'm not aware of any interstate bridges that we've replaced with ER money recently. But certainly if we go back to Hurricane Irene, I'll just ballpark that we've probably replaced 100 bridges on the state system between Hurricane Irene, the flooding of 23 and 24. And then obviously innumerable culverts and, slope stabilization, things like that.
Well, Jeremy and Candace, thank you very much for kind of putting through our tough news portion. Representative McCoy, you weren't here earlier, but we are changing the schedule this morning. We're breaking at 10 o'clock and Logan will be back at the 10:30, 10:35 when we start back up. There's members that had requested and Logan was able to come.